So welcome to the Kanban Coaching Exchange. It's great to see you all here on a very dreary Thursday night in Norwich. So hopefully the summer won't be too long. But tonight we're very honoured to have Alexei Zheglov joining us. Now, if you've not come across Alexei before, he is literally a legend in Kanban. If there isn't anything that this guy doesn't know about Agile Kanban, probably even life, maths, statistics, I could probably go on. There's probably like a little hobby in there or something as well that he's probably a super expert in. But Alexei is an absolute font of all knowledge. And I know if I've got any challenges or if I don't understand anything, I can always go and catch up with Alexei, and he's always willing to give a helping hand. And so it's a bit of a no-brainer. He's a regular at the Kanban Coaching Exchange. I love to have him every year because he's always bringing new, fresh ideas and things to get us thinking about, which we can apply in our organizations and our ways of working. So with great pleasure, I'm going to hand you over to Alexei. Take it away.
So, Helen, thank you very much for another opportunity to present at the event you're hosting. Indeed, there will be some new knowledge, some new systematization of some existing knowledge, and I really look forward to the next hour. A few words about myself to wrap up the introduction. In short, what I do has followed a long arc from largely mathematical, technical, and engineering type of work towards people problems, customer satisfaction, improving business, and so on. And that naturally brought me to Kanban almost 15 years ago. It coincided with the publication of the famous Blue Book by the Kanban pioneer, David Anderson. And of course, I didn't know at the time that several years later, I would be co-writing a book with David, known as Fit for Purpose. I've presented at a number of Kanban conferences, and I believe the first time I was on stage at the Kanban conference was in 2014 in San Francisco. That was a presentation about the knowledge discovery process and how a network of knowledge workers creates it. I'm actually giving somewhat of a preview of what's coming later in this presentation. In my kind of work based in Canada, I helped others apply Kanban, helped find paths to continuous improvement, and ended up developing, teaching, mentoring a number of people who can call themselves experts in this method today. So I've been in for and with Kanban for quite some time. Squirrel North is a small consulting company that I co-founded with several fellow Canadians. We're dedicated to improving businesses, and we lean quite a lot on the Kanban method. All right, so let's start. First of all, I want to get a feel for how loaded the word scale really is. Can you define it? Can you use it in a sentence? What's your idea of scale? Well, here are some different ideas. It could be scale on a map. It could be a weighing scale. And people who attended Kanban leadership conferences in the Austrian Alps would recognize that mountain. What about scaling that mountain? So clearly everyone has a different idea, and that's just before we begin to talk about scale as a measure of size. And when we talk about size, there is this cliche expression that, and I'm going to split hairs here a little bit. Why do we say in all shapes and sizes, as let's say companies come in all shapes and sizes? why don't we say just in different sizes? The word shape is key here. The shape is an intuitive communication that multiple dimensions are present. And so one important takeaway from this presentation, I'm going to kind of present it and break it down, is what I see as a system of 5 dimensions. And the challenges around scale, how you deal with size in the continuous improvement initiative in your company, extends in these 5 dimensions. So it's not a one-dimensional thing. You can have more of this and less of that, right? So it has a shape. So I'm going to give you this system of 5 dimensions where you can orient yourself exactly which of these dimensions are more prominent in your particular case, in which of them you are extending your continuous improvement footprint right now, and so on. And this will basically be kind of your map. Before I proceed with defining, presenting, and giving some advice what to do in each dimension, I just want to say something about the method. How do we know the stuff that I'm about to share with you? Well, a number of people, such as myself, such as Helen, such as several others in this meeting, have applied the so-called Kanban method during the last decade or so. In different companies, different countries, companies of different sizes, in different industries, with different cultures. The result is a lot of stories of continuous improvement. We met at conferences. We met during video calls like this one. We met at less formal opportunities. We talked to each other. We followed each other on social media. We exchanged these ideas and stories. And collectively, we know a lot about how continuous improvement actually happens in a large variety of companies. Now, the way the Kanban method works, and I'm just going to repeat this for those of you familiar with it, theoretically or practically, you know this, but I'm just going to set the baseline. It's not a process framework that you apply as a choice of several others. It's a method that you apply to any process to provoke it to improve. So you take any pre-existing process, you do not replace it with something else. Instead, you apply to Kanban to it. And what happens, you understand it better, what's going on, and you get some practical ideas how to improve it. You stimulate it to improve, and then it improves. You get a better process as a result, better than before. So that's how it works. So collectively, the Kanban community has a lot of stories like that, how it actually plays out in all sorts of companies. Can we now take this large collection of experiences and filter them by how did we deal with scale or size or what dimension of that scale in that particular case? And can we identify some patterns out of this large set of experiences and classify them perhaps along these 5 dimensions? That's basically how we know this stuff. The good news here is that, well, it doesn't really matter what improvement method you choose at your company, because your company's story fits somewhere in that large universe of improvement stories that we've collected. So whether you actually use explicitly or implicitly the Kanban method, or you choose something else, there's something about the situation in your company and maybe in a similar company in our collective experience that applies to you, that is relevant to you. And so whatever we learned thanks to applying Kanban over the last 10 years is applicable pretty universally. Your company fits somewhere in this scheme. All right, so without any more words, let's jump into what these 5 dimensions are. I'm going to define them first and kind of give you a feel for what sort of problem you're dealing in each of them, how you like get a feel for them. And I'm going to revisit them and give you a little bit more guidance in depth, what the typical patterns are in each dimension and how to deal with them. So I'm going to start with width. And the main idea here is that we want to extend our continuous improvement effort from a relatively perhaps narrow sphere of influence to basically the entire process end to end. Right? So we want to scale in width along the value stream, simply put. So usually when you do this, you may start with just one team or maybe a few teams and activities performed by those teams. And then you eventually get more departments of the company involved. You may get a more direct access to your customers, both on the kind of upstream end when you take some requests from them or when you decide to build something for them, to all the way to delivery, and you can get some customer contact on that end as well. Usually you get more decision points in the picture, perhaps decision points that you didn't see before when the scope of your improvement initiative was narrow. And what constitutes time and process changes as well. So if, let's say, you started with one team, basically the cycle time of whatever that team does was your understanding of time. But then you realize, well, there's something else that happens before work gets to this team, something that happens after. So actually, maybe the important moments when you start and finish measuring time and process are kind of outside this team. So so the time feels differently now. There is one key pattern in the Kanban method that deals with this particular scaling dimension. It's called aggregated team Kanban. So you can have multiple activities and you basically effectively glue several Kanban boards together. The done state of one becomes the kind of to-do state of the next board. So as shown in the diagram. All right, so that's all for now. I will return to this dimension in a few minutes to present a key challenges and some patterns for how to address them. The next dimension is height, which is kind of orthogonal to width. So this has to do with decomposition, flow on multiple levels of boards where you represent cards of different size, larger cards breaking down into smaller cards. For example, those of you in the software field sometimes use words like sagas, epics, and stories to represent work items of different size. Sagas break down into epics, epics break down into stories, and so on. And you may need sometimes 2 or 3 levels of boards to represent the flow of those work items. You have some challenges of traceability, such as, which epic does this story belong or which saga does this epic belong. If you work in a somewhat different field, let's say life sciences, let's say you want to run a clinical trial for a drug, well, that would break down into a bunch of doctor files, and each doctor file could break down into a bunch of customer file work items. So again, you have decomposition and flow on multiple levels. So that's the height dimension. And there's 3 more. Sometimes, let's say we have a service or some kind of product line. It's a substantially complicated process that extends in both both width and height. Yes, we mapped it out end to end. There's like 10 activities. And actually, some of those activities involve decomposition, and there's flow on multiple levels, and we've got multiple levels of boards to represent it. However, what if we try to improve not one such service, but let's say 30 of them across the company? And then it turns out that these services don't exist in isolation. They are somehow connected and dependent on each other. And sometimes directly, and sometimes via some, well, maybe 2 or 3 links in the network of services. And this kind of network effect presents an additional challenge. And improving a network of multiple services is not the same as improving any of them in isolation. And that's the depth dimension. So one of the important realizations when you pursue improvement in this dimension is realizing that everyone, every manager of every service, every key person within any project, service, or product line is both a customer and a service provider. Yes, you have your own customers whom you deliver to, and at the same time, you rely on other services to get your result. And so you act as a customer before some other service, and they treat you as customer. And in turn, they depend on someone else, and so they are a customer too. So in a few minutes, I'll give you some keys to this dimension, but let's move forward. And that's the so-called scale-free assumption. And I'm going to kind of reflect on the fact that looks, may sound very kind of ordinary. And actually, like one of these boards is a pretty famous board, and from a certain company in Seattle, circa 2006, where several people worked that would later become famous thanks to Kanban. But think of this. Let's say, would it be unusual to find a card on a visual board in your company that represents some sort of product feature or some enhancement that takes maybe a team and a few specialists like 1 month of work? No, not at all. This is not unusual. All right, well, if 10 people work on something for a month, that's 200 person days of work. Actually, on that famous Kanban board in the center of the screen, the stickies on the left, each of them is roughly of that scale. So hundreds of person days of work and the corresponding value that is worth that sort of expense. At the same time, can you imagine at the same company that has this, well, not unusual kind of size of a work item? Can you imagine, let's say, their technical support or fix-it sort of department, business as usual, keeping the lights on, where a ticket comes in and the expectation is it will be closed through the efforts of one specialist, maybe within a day or next day at the latest, right? So the amount of work is maybe a few person hours or maybe a person day or two. Of course. And the boards on the left actually show examples of some of the much smaller work items. So it's become quite common, and I just want to bring this to your attention because people don't like always realize this, that within the same company, even within the same department, you can have work items that are different in terms of size by 2 or 3 orders of magnitude. A few person hours and a few hundred person days, right? That's about 1,000 to 1. Yet when you design Kanban boards for them, well, you design them pretty much out of the same ingredients using the same principles and let's say a technique known as static, right? So somehow something scales naturally. There is no difficulty scaling between like within this range, right? So you just do it to scale Kanban, apply Kanban. However, I'm going to show you one example. Now, it comes from a certain company that is kind of secretive, so the image you're about to see is significantly redacted and blurred out. But some of you have heard me talk about this experience because it actually kind of taught me a few lessons and showed me kind of it really expanded the boundaries for me and in the Kanban method. So can you imagine this? So it's in a life science company. And what they decided to do, they Kanbanized their drug development pipeline. One card on this board is one drug. The cycle time from left side of this board to the right-hand side, from start to finish, well, could be 5 years, could be 7. The executive team meets at daily stand-ups once a month, because that's the scale of time. They don't need to literally meet every day. So their daily stand-up is once a month. What's interesting, the color of cards represents the type of disease being treated. So let's say cancer is represented with one color, some blood diseases with a different color, some common cold with yet another color, and so on. There are multiple swim lanes because some of these drugs rely on kind of chemical technology. Some of them are genetically engineered, some of them are original, some of them are generic, which means not only different cost of delay, but also different protocol for clinical testing, for example. So there's some variation in the column structure, and that's what the swim lanes are for. And you can see this board is designed basically out of the very same ingredients that you would use to design a board for a software team or let's say a large project, or even a board for, let's say, keeping the lights on or any kind of shared service. So it's designed out of the same principle, but out of the same principles using the same techniques. Same ingredients are used here, but it's of a completely different scale, right? So it's kind of the outer end of that scale. So I just want to show you that this is possible. And sometimes you can get away with a scale-free assumption. That's something that works at this scale, but just automatically works at a much larger scale without much difficulty. So what we want to do in this dimension is to write this scale-free assumption as far as possible and not to create any sort of scaling challenge where there isn't one. How to do this in a few minutes. Finally, the knowledge dimension, which I believe is the hardest. We deal with a hard problem here, and I'll just tell you how it feels from a story. So I was working with a company. As a consultant, it wasn't a full-time gig, so I made a few visits, and in between visits, they were on their own. There was a chief coach there, internal coach, and a small team of coaches. I taught them a few things, and they basically were like applying static designing Kanban systems around the company, one service at a time. Now, I thought this would not go very well at the start because of my limited involvement and kind of lack of direct involvement and control. I thought, okay, well, I learned static from Kanban originators and like early adopters, real experts like David Anderson and Mike Burrows. Well, okay, maybe I know something, but I mean, my clients, they're not as lucky. They had to learn from me. Not only that, they had to teach it to other people. So how long until this becomes a broken telephone? And the quality of designs basically goes down to an unacceptable level. And it turns out the quality didn't go down at all. it turned out it actually stayed remarkably high, and so somehow we managed to solve that hard problem in that particular case. However, kind of broadly speaking, we've got a number of standard ways to propagate knowledge, such as training and coaching, and each of them, of course, has some obvious benefits and shortcomings. All right, so let's go back to the width dimension, and I'm going to say a few things like in more depth. So we're going to revisit them. I'm going to give keys to success in each dimension. However, what I'm about to say exists in a more expanded version. If you click on that QR code and that link, it leads to the Squirrel North website, where is an article that I wrote a few months ago that actually dives at some depth in each of the 5 dimensions and gives you some patterns, and it's going to be more explanatory than this talk. So in this talk, I'm kind of presenting more of an overview. So by all means, please take advantage of this resource. And I'm going to kind of jump into the width dimension again. Folks, in width dimension, so I'm just gonna show you kind of three pictures, each kind of presenting a different kind of problem, and these are all known problems, and we have some solutions for them. So first of all, you're going to see differently. Let's say on the left-hand side, you have a team board, because your continuous improvement footprint was narrower. You were working with this team or maybe a few teams. They have a simple board. They have a backlog. There may be some dependencies between X, Y, and Z in that backlog. Now I'm going to show you another picture. And my leading question is, can you spot X, Y, and Z in that picture? Where are they? All right, here it comes. Where are they? Well, they've become columns of another board, which we just redesigned with static around a customer-facing service where, let's say, the work that was done by that team was a local activity. And what's in focus in this picture is some kind of customer recognizable feature that goes through these activities where different teams and specialists potentially making contributions to discover knowledge that we eventually deliver to the customer. So it's a pivot to a very different view of your process. And now we are much closer to seeing it end to end. There could be potentially other activities involved, which is beside the point. Let's say you've got something going on end to end, and I intentionally simplified this picture kind of on the right-hand side of this diagram. Folks, I'm not going to belabor points about local optimization versus global optimization. You are all smart, experienced people. You already know that. But let's say initially your improvement focused on one of those squares on the right-hand side of this diagram. And let's say you scaled in the width dimension and you reached further left. Well, at some point, you are going to touch those purple lines. What is happening there? Well, let's say you run a business that serves multiple market segments, and you also have a government regulator to please. And while you were residing in one of those squares on the right-hand side, you just didn't have to deal with the decision that involved pleasing these two market segments and the government and their proxies and stakeholders. Now you do. And are you going to encounter some sort of stakeholder conflict here? Are they going to basically try to win at each other's expense? If so, how do you turn it into cooperation? And this is a problem that's going to require some leadership to solve. So it doesn't have a technical solution, it takes leadership. Thanks to the Kanban maturity model, which has a leadership extension and which Kanban maturity model actually allows us to say whole sagas of continuous improvement in pretty concise shorthand. Look for leadership maturity level 3. You're going to need people with this sort of quality to address this problem. And that's one of the keys. Time lives in this width dimension as well. And let's say let's say expanded our improvement initiative. It's end-to-end the whole process. And let's say the time starts here, ends here, and that's a longer scope than previously, right? It's now truly end-to-end. So, folks, if this time matters from somewhere to somewhere, here's a very important realization. So does the inventory in the very same process scope. So I'm not going to argue with you exactly where the time should start and where you should stop the clock. This can vary by process. It can even vary by, let's say, the type of customer, right? However, if you decide that this is when the clock starts and this is when it stops, you have to admit the inventory between those endpoints matters too. So Kanban dispenses with the wishful thinking that you can satisfy a time criterion and keep time predictable with an arbitrary volume of inventory, right? So you have to keep inventory under control. So it cannot just grow to infinity. And if we've got our inventory under control, we have a de facto Kanban system within that process range. So it's of sufficient scale in width. Generally speaking, there's a couple of good reasons to measure time. One of them is because it's a criterion that matters to customers. And another reason is making better decisions, such as when should we start something because we need it by a certain date. Interestingly, both questions, both reasons are usually very good for business because businesses do need to satisfy customers by their criteria. And businesses need to make better decisions. So such business objectives may, on one hand, provide motivations for introducing a Kanban system and scaling it sufficiently in the width dimension. But at the same time, a good enough, sufficiently effective Kanban system of that scale becomes an operational solution that answers to the business need. So that's basically where Kanban meet business. They don't live in isolation. And through the time element and the width dimension, the two connect. Going forward to the height dimension. So there are basically two most important bits of advice here. One of them does not involve actually changing the hierarchy, how you exactly do your decomposition, but it deals with how to effectively represent it visually with less overhead. And here you have to question, does everything have to be a card? Well, sometimes you can actually take care of decomposition, but actually, let's say, implement tasks as a checklist, as an explicit policy. Sometimes, as you saw in the previous example, some of your cards become workflow activities. They become columns or spaces on your board. Things like batches and releases, again, can be dealt with, let's say, replenishment and delivery cadences, right? Rather than have an item that sits on the board for several months and then predictably moves to doing on the known date. So by questioning, does everything have to be a card, and is there some other geometric way to represent it, you may be able to design boards that just look simpler, that easier to read, that reduce your cognitive overhead. And folks, another approach, complementary approach, has something to do with questioning actually how many levels you have. So the very process of decomposition. So I'm going to ask, what's the typical fan out ratio between the levels? So if you have a work item, a large work item at the higher level, you break it down into n work items of the next adjacent lower level. Well, how big is n? Does your story break down into? Does your epic break down into 3 stories? Does your saga break down into 4 epics? Well, that's a low fan out ratio. And what this leads to is a relatively low information gain between levels, high overhead, because you're going to have to maintain a lot of levels of boards and a lot of traceability between the levels. And you end up with too many levels because, well, maybe the highest level is just isn't big enough for your customers, and the low level is just not small enough to make it flow through the teams. And with high fan out ratios, just made a typo there. I should say high. So 1 to 10, 1 to 20, that's a much higher ratio. You get a lot more info gain from each level. You get less overhead because there are fewer levels to track and less traceability errors. And you end up with fewer levels as well. So you may end up with fewer levels to visualize, or fewer levels to begin with, if you pursue relentlessly these 2 questions. And this is really the key to scaling in height. As far as depth, now we're talking about the network of services and whatever network effects that happen there, just because we're not improving any one service in isolation. A really important principle here is the principle of cadence. It is absolutely essential not to let any sort of informational signal linger somewhere in that network and not propagate in a timely manner where someone actually needs to know it. And out of the book that has become a classic in continuous improvement field in intellectual industries, Don Reinertson's Principles of Product Development Flow, 2 of those 175 principles are the cadence reliability principles and the variability substitution principles. So we basically substitute variability in time for variability in content. We don't care how strong the signal is. We care that it propagates in a timely fashion. And how do we typically implement these principles? Using, let's say, Kanban cadences such as replenishment, service delivery review, ops review. The important thing is that these must occur with regularity, as opposed to waiting until whenever we get some sort of insight or change. The scale-free assumption. So what was the trick to actually spanning many levels of magnitude, as many orders of magnitude, when designing those very different Kanban boards for very different processes of different scales out of the same ingredients and based on the same principles, using the same techniques? So the key concept is the work item type. That's a unit of commitment. And it's a choice you make when you design a Kanban system. So what constitutes a work item in this system? So the key here is to model commitments at their natural scale. So your business already operates at a certain scale when it engages with its customers. The unit of commitment, this is what it looks like. You make that a work item type in your Kanban system. And that allows us to avoid scaling problems where we don't have any. Folks, the knowledge dimension is indeed the hardest because out of that 12 years of experience, I don't really have a deeper reflection than when we see a gem, we find, well, basically, when we found a gem, we just keep it. So static, the systems thinking approach to introducing Kanban, has been referred to as Kanban's hidden gem. So it's a picture I took at the Kanban conference in Hamburg almost 10 years ago. It turns out it was really the magic that allowed someone to teach how to design a Kanban system, and that person teaches the next, and that person teaches the next, and some coach teaches the manager teaches another manager. And there is really no dissipation of quality, right? So it's just everyone learns very quickly by practicing, by doing a language that allows us to talk about our patterns of flow in our company and be understood by each other. And so we realized that static has this sort of magic power to propagate knowledge about how to see flow and how to improve it without much dissipation of quality. And then several years later, the Kanban maturity model effectively solved the same problems for coaches. As I said, it now allows sharing coaching level advice and guidance in the network of coaches much more effectively than before. And it allows to avoid known failure modes. It allows to apply contextually appropriate advice across many different companies predictably. So those two were the Kanban community's main answers to this knowledge problem. Folks, now I'm going to jump into the new stuff that is absolutely exciting. And this is, I put this together after Helen had already reached out to me with the invitation to present today. So how much time do I get? Maybe it doesn't really matter because I mean to keep it quickly because this is going to be intense, unusual, and really thought-provoking, but eventually useful. Folks, there is a very interesting book written by a scientist named Geoffrey West. And the book is called Scale, and it has a long subtitle, which you can read. So West, who is originally from the UK, went to basically study for his postdoctoral studies in the United States and eventually stayed there forever. He became a theoretical physicist, made a fine career in the field of elementary particles, and then at around the sixth decade of his life, he decided to change the field and go into biology and all sorts of interdisciplinary studies and whatnot. So he soon discovered that kind of biology sort of lacks some mathematical or theoretical rigor present in physics. So in physics, like there are some laws of planetary motion, right? But let's say those same laws have mathematical derivation. Sir Isaac Newton did that in the 17th century. Biology doesn't have an equivalent of that. It's a much more experimental and descriptive science. And so West sought to kind of bring some theory and experiment balance to biology from his favorite field of physics. And so this is what he found. And there are some ways a scale plays out in living out organisms, cities, social networks, and companies, where you can plot different characteristics of those things, and suddenly you see basically, well, straight lines like in this diagram. So let's look at this phenomenon just a little bit deeper. So animals, which West talks first about in his book. So they scale by the so-called law of 3/4. So what this means is, so we take the body mass of an animal on a horizontal scale, and you can notice this is a logarithmic scale. So basically one notch on the scale is an increase of an order of magnitude. And on the vertical scale, and again, it's also a logarithmic scale. That's the metabolic rate of that animal. Basically, how much energy can that animal process and convert into like what it needs to do for a living. And it turns out that the metabolic rate scales with some economy of scale. If we increase the size of the animal by 4 orders of magnitude, its metabolic rate only increases by 3 orders of magnitude. So plot these two quantities on a log-log scale, and we get an incline of about 3/4. So actually, every farmer has known this since a very long time. So basically, if you need to plow a field, you need a horse, and it's much better than a pack of dogs. Even if a pack of dogs produce the same power as the horse, they're going to eat a whole lot more. A horse is much more efficient as far as the feed. What's interesting about this law of 3/4 that it actually has a theoretical derivation. This is remarkable. You can actually derive this from a few first principles. So basically, you see an animal as a sort of space-filling metabolic network. It has invariant terminal units. Well, for bloodstream, those would be capillaries. And basically, the network has to optimize itself. It has to optimally deliver the stuff to its terminal units. So it turns out it's possible to derive this like mathematically. It appears to be within the mathematical apparatus of a sufficiently skilled theoretical physicist. What's interesting, although this doesn't have such an easy mathematical derivation, so it's a more empirical fact, the physical infrastructure of cities scales the same way. So we increase the size of a city by some number of orders of magnitude, and the amount of infrastructure, such as miles of roads, pipelines, electric cables, sidewalks, and so on and so forth, post offices, it just doesn't increase by the same number of order of magnitudes, by a little bit less. So the exponent is not 0.75 as it is for the animals, but 0.85. But it's essentially the same phenomenon. Now, what's interesting, I'm going to ask you to remember this. Larger animals actually live at a slower pace. They live longer at a slower pace, and they experience a lower heartbeat rate. What's interesting is that the cities, besides their physical infrastructure, also have kind of a social network component where citizens come together, they talk to each other, they meet in places, and they start new companies, they discover ideas, they create some sort of innovation and produce wealth. And that stuff scales. And what's interesting is the exponent is not less than 1, but greater than 1. 1.15. So cities actually produce a network effect in the sense that instead of economy of scale when it comes to innovation and wealth, there is excess return for the same scale. And what's also interesting, people in larger cities walk faster, and they also talk faster, not slower. So with greater size comes an increased pace of life. And finally, West studies companies the same way and basically finds that they have both the infrastructure component and the social network component, and the exponent is just 1. So it's just scale naturally and linearly proportional to size. All right, so what's interesting here is that there are 2 very different kinds of scaling, superlinear and sublinear. Superlinear means the exponent is greater than 1, and that means that the picture at the bottom, we get excess returns for the same scale. And the sublinear scaling is, well, we get economies of scale. So the greater the scale, the less cost per unit. And what's interesting that the flow that these 2 patterns result in networks that are very different in design. And what's like the most striking difference in those designs is if we look at the like a typical animal which is designed for, well, basically the efficiencies of scale of its metabolic network. Where is the greatest flow rate in our bloodstream? It's through the aorta. And then aorta breaks down into several arteries that have a little bit less flow rate, and those break down into smaller arteries, ultimately to the capillaries, where the flow is the slowest. Something similar happens in transportation networks in cities. The greatest flow is through the roads that are no accident, called arterial, right? So that's where your largest highways, train stations, and so on. And the least flow is through small streets in outer neighborhoods. And this is basically the traditional industrial org design. This is how your aorta is your annual budget. It breaks down into several departmental budgets, which break down into a few others. And as a terminal unit, you have an employee, which is a position somewhere in HR database with described responsibilities and a salary range and the expectation of performing certain functions. And that's your traditional industrial org design. What's interesting about the social networks is that the greatest flow is near the terminal units. And that's what makes them scale super linearly. Now, as you heard me talk through all of this, well, first of all, what you may realize is that some of the approaches to scaling that simply involve creating an overhead that basically increases as n squared, as the square of the number of team members. That's just a naive approach. A scaling approach that simply slows down the pace from 2 week time boxes to 3 months time boxes is also naive. And generally, just give me a bigger number is a naive approach to scale, right? So there's a lot more to it. There's some real science. I think at this point, you may get a very provocative question on your mind. Shouldn't we build our future companies in knowledge work fields as social networks? Yes, and if you were to build an electric network, let's say as an engineer, you would know what to build it on. You would know your outlets and wires and substations and whatnot, right? If you were to build the transportation network or logistical network, you would know your warehouses and couriers and trains and trucks and so on. So if you want to build social networks, what's your choice of terminal units then? And that's a question we have to answer so that the title of this slide doesn't sound like a hopeless impractical platitude. And I just want to point out a couple of very compatible approaches. And so one of them, the credit for it goes to my Toronto neighbor, colleague and friend, Jeff Anderson, who just recently wrote a book, Organizing Toward Agility, in which he actually deals with teaming, pairing, mobbing, and all sorts of ways people and teams interact in the enterprise. And he looks for patterns that are simple and repeatable enough to work at scale. So he effectively chooses people and teams as terminal units, and he figures out how to connect them in all sorts of optimal ways, how they really connect in the real world. And another approach, different and yet based on essentially the same principles, you have to answer the question about what are your terminal units and how do they connect. Kanban methods makes a somewhat different choice. The services are the terminal units. And so, well, you Kanbanize and improve your service, but then you improve interactions with your service. So through demand analysis and dependencies, and then you improve using Kanban cadences, your business as a network of independent services. So again, the Kanban method offers an approach which now has a foundation in this science of scale that basically makes a very clear choice of what constitutes a terminal unit in our network, and then how to connect these terminal units so that we can have a network that scales super linearly. So that produces excess returns that ultimately lead to innovation and customer success. And that's what I'm going to leave you with at the end of the day. Thank you very much for letting me present this and share some of the latest thoughts on scale. And I'll be happy to take questions, which I see there is a number above the chat box that suggests there are many.
So thank you very much, Alexei. So let's give him a little round of applause. Okay, so feel free to put your hand up to ask questions, or if you don't want to ask your questions out loud, what you can do is you can pop it into the chat channel. Alexei, your video has just gone off, just in case you didn't know. So I'll kick us off with a question, Alexei. So there's a lot of really great content in here about the depth, the breadth, and thinking about the systems. If people are starting to think about scaling in their organization, what can they do to get themselves started? Is Alexei still there?
Yeah, yes.
Oh, there you go.
All right. So I was just switching between two video modes. So, folks, to get started, I think it's important to understand where your improvement footprint is right now, and what's your sphere of influence, where you can make decisions, where you can influence people, where you can control certain things, and which things are effectively outside your control for now. They may become part of your control now. So you may notice sometimes, let's say you're a coach and you're hired to coach a team, right? And it turns out, well, there is the rest of the organization. Something happens there. And, well, let's say what happens with this team, well, you can do a lot about it. What happens to the rest of the organization? Maybe not. Or maybe your initial context is not this team, but maybe a group of teams. Or maybe it's a product group, maybe a project department, maybe some kind of business unit or a group of organizational units in the company, some subset of a company. That's where you start. So it's very important to understand what's within your kind of control or influence, where you can make something happen and where kind of the boundaries are. At some point, you're going to need to like increase it. So let's say one important case is if you ask questions about time in let's say process from a customer's perspective. When does it start and when does it end? And then where are these moments in the process as you see it now? And you may find out that, well, this team is busy with some work because someone made a decision 3 months ago and promised something to a customer, right? That means an important point in the process is outside your sphere of influence. And the same thing may happen on the kind of on the far end of the process. So let's say your team deployed something to production, but we don't really know if customers, if users are actually using that, if there's some uptake of that new feature, if they're actually getting value out of it. And that endpoint is also outside the process, and it's outside your current sphere of influence. Eventually, these things will come into your, hopefully, into your sphere of influence. So you will be focused on kind of broadening this end to end, kind of left and right from where you started. But it's important to understand where you're starting right now.
Brilliant. Thank you. So, Tomo, you've got a question.
I do. This scale thing is very exciting, but I haven't quite got my head around it yet. The the determiner of whether something's a superlinear or sublinear system is in the inherent mathematics that describe it. So if that's true, isn't it? Can you change it?
So I would say it's it's so what I presented there was kind of more of a like to kind of send the message that some of the things we do with our improvement methods uh, aren't just our ideas or opinions. It turns out that some of them have certain, let's say, foundations, and let's say the network theory, right, which Professor West explored. And it's important to question our experiences, our interpretations of our experiences, our ideas and our opinions, sometimes against basically what a scientist would say about it. And that was what I meant to say by this. So it's not something like you would actually like do in your company. Let's make one like a plot like one of the charts in Professor West's book. However, I would say you can ask a question like, where is our company in this life cycle, and therefore, how should it be built? Are we a rapidly growing, innovating company, or are we an established company built for economies of scale? And that will have some important implications on how you actually design network of like how people interact and work with each other in your company. And so that bit about super and sublinear scaling, now I'm just going to like, as soon as I used any math term, I'm gonna like push it aside and translate it into something that sounds more like plain English. So depending on what kind of company you run, that may have a big effect upon what kind of decisions you make, how you design kind of the work experience in that company. So whether you go for economies of scale or for excess returns, given the same scale, because those lead to very different uh, basically designs of a social network within the company. Does that make sense?
An economy of scale that pairs with the sublinear. What's the word we call for superlinears? Or what's the
Well, I
optimization?
would say it's an excess return given the same scale. So basically, you get more return from kind of increasing than kind of you get kind of greater than the proportional amount of let's say some positive return, be it innovation or wealth or some other good stuff.
But isn't that economy of scale too? The more you do, the cheaper it gets.
No, because it's the other way around. So to all right, to put it simply, if let's say we go from a very small city, let's say pick any city in America, let's say with a population of about 100,000, and we go from there to New York City. So basically what's going to happen, the infrastructure such as like amount of roads, all sorts of like pipes, cables and whatnot, physical infrastructure in New York City is per capita is going to be less. And that's economy of scale. However, the amount of wealth and innovation, inventions, and things that happen due to interactions of people per capita is going to be greater in New York City than in that smaller city. So it's going to be greater than, so we just increased the size of the city by a factor of 100. Well, we're going to get more than 100 times increase in basically innovation and that sort of production. Whereas on the infrastructure, we're going to spend less than 100 more.